everybody here today. Maybe you guys could introduce yourselves after I just talk for a few seconds. And so my name is Dr. Susan Swim, and we have a nonprofit called Now We See a Person Institute, where for 40 years we have worked in a way that does not pathologize people for having the symptoms from really the hardships of life. So if we have hardships in life, which I think people are calling trauma at this point in time, we're going to have symptoms. There's no way that we are just like some kind of robot. And so I'm old enough in this profession that there was a time when we could have symptoms and we weren't labeled as mentally ill. We were just labeled as people that were going through difficult times, and our prognosis was always good. We were expected to get past this. And then in the 80s, things really changed drastically. And we were told that we had biological problems that possibly due to the stress or due to some pre-wiring or pre-biological factors, that we had this propensity because we had these deficiencies to react differently than other people would react. So that means that even if, let's just take this having an affair or one of your children died in an unfortunate accident, that those types of things at one point in time, you would see talk therapy. And talk therapy at that point in time was a very positive therapy. It didn't talk about your weaknesses, it talked more about your strengths. And so you could go in with a clinician and talk about the things that had happened to you and come out at the other end and never look back. So you never looked back that you had a significant mental illness diagnosis. And as we all know, what has happened is that this has drastically changed. And at one point in time, and we can talk about this, Ashley, later, but Ashley said that when she was given a mental illness diagnosis as a young child, that it was like a death sentence, because you're convinced that regardless of whatever trauma that you may or may not have had, that you have a biological problem and you just need to take the medication like your dad or your mom might take for high blood pressure or diabetes, and you would have to manage your symptoms for the rest of your lives. And we have heard that time and time again. And for me, that's a very dangerous narrative to be able, especially to tell young people or people at any stage, that they are not going to be able to recover. Because there's actually not a lot of research on that. We are a research institute. And so we have researched 40 years of people that have been able to recover because they haven't had those experiences of what a friend of mine calls commercialized psychiatry, where you're told that you have an unfortunate experience, but most of that focus is on your symptoms. In fact, when we see symptoms, we think, oh my goodness, what has that person been through? Instead of how do we eliminate the symptoms? How does life for this person start to be reclaimed, and reclaimed in a way that has certainly better outcomes than what led for them to have the symptoms in the first place. So just to talk a little bit about Now I See a Person Institute, it is a nonprofit devoted to helping people who have had significant mental illness diagnoses and treatment find full sustainability and transformation. So enough about that. I want for my wonderful guest here to introduce themselves, and maybe you could introduce yourself first, if that would be okay.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. Yes, I think the conversation is really important and it's ripe. It has needed to happen for a long time. I think the idea of medicating and labels, and I'll tell you my personal story, but one of the things I have always said is before I even got into the work that I do now, and I like to call myself an accidental advocate because I never chose to do the drug safety work. But prior to that, I had helped start an organization in Minnesota that came from art therapists out in California called Free Arts. And it was using the power of art, working with kids that had been abused, neglected, at risk. And it was putting them together with mentorship and really giving them a voice and a safe place. And I remember one of the first times we had finally got the program up and running, and we were in a group working with a group home. And these are kids that are 8 to 12 years old that were removed from the home. They're living in a dorm-like situation because they saw things that nobody should see. parents, like a dad that murdered their mom, things like horrific traumas, right? And these kids were like amazing, and we were just doing art and hanging out with them, and we were their volunteers. And I remember the staff said, "Hey kids, you want to go see where the volunteers, or hey kids, you want to show the volunteers where you live?" And they're all like, "Yeah." And I remember we walked into the locked hall, and this was in 1997. Every one of the kids picked up a cup of meds. And I was like, oh my God, are they all sick? Thinking I'm thinking like strep throat. And she goes, oh no, this is their behavior medicine. Behavior medicine. I'd never even heard of that. And so so that was like my first into this whole crazy world that I am in now. But the reason I call myself a drug safety advocate is because something hit me. I was living my life, everything was fine. I was advertising, I was doing these fun other organizations starting. And my husband of 10 years was given an antidepressant for insomnia. And literally, because he had just started his dream job with a startup company, literally 5 weeks later, he was found dead. He took his life with no history of depression, literally nothing. My whole life, I was out of town the first 3 weeks he was on these drugs. So I didn't even know anything. I didn't even know it was Zoloft, what he was taking. And so when I was out of town on a big BMW production in another country, I come back. Woody walks through my back door and he's completely drenched in his blue dress shirt, and he fell to the floor, his hands around his head like a vice, and he kept going, Kim, you got to help me. I don't know what's happened to me. My head's outside my body. You got to help me. And he's bawling. And I'm like, you calmed him down. He did breathing, and then eventually called the doctor, his GP, and said, oh, you got to give it 4 to 6 weeks to kick in. And so every night the next week, Woody was like, help me what do you think about this? I'm going to beat this feeling. Everything was beat this feeling in his head. And so, as you can imagine, I left to go out of town. Again, it was my busy time of season, and we traveled all the time. So traveling was no big deal for either one of us. But so I hadn't heard from him all day. And I go, hey, Dad, do me a favor. I haven't heard from Woody. So my dad goes over to the house, and there he had to go and discover probably something that he'll never, ever forget. But he had to call me to tell me that Woody was found hanging. And literally that night, when my entire life fell apart, the coroner got on the phone and asked one simple question. And that simple question was he taking any medication? And the only medication Woody was on was Zoloft. And she proceeded to say, we're going to take it with us. It might have something to do with his death. And so that was kind of clue number one, but everything intuitively in me was like, there's no way Woody killed himself. Depressed, that's not what I like. I would never, like, he was running, he was doing all this. There was no way. And then also the front page, the same day, Woody did not leave a note. He left notes all the time for traveling. When he traveled or I traveled, there was always notes. He would put them in my suitcase, or no note on the biggest journey, as I call it, the biggest trip of my life, his life, no note. But the other clue that night was the front page of our newspaper had an article that said the UK finds link between antidepressants and suicide in teens. And so literally between the question about the drug, this newspaper, and a deep knowing there's no way Woody killed himself, that became a mission for us to go get warnings, black box suicide warnings, because this was in 2003. And what I learned is that in 91, the FDA had hearings when it was just Prozac on the market, and it was on the emergence of violence and suicide. And almost every one of those advisory board members took money from companies making antidepressant products. So they all went, nope, I don't see anything. And so fast forward, now it's 2002 when or 2003 when Woody got put on the drug. But in 2004, we did get warnings added for young adult to 18, and then 2006 we got to 24. The reality is all ages are at risk. They know that's an artificial cutoff. It should be warning. But through this whole process, I had a big lawsuit against Pfizer where I got documents out from under seal that these guys have known about it, all of them, starting with Germany never approved Prozac initially for two reasons: lack of efficacy and risk of suicide. And eventually they did approve it only when it was recommended with a tranquilizer. And that should tell you everything about what the chemicals were. But more importantly, after all of this happened and I started going into the system, for me personally, as you can imagine, my life, literally, that is the trauma that you're talking about, that you talked about at the beginning of the show. I was at the doctor, and literally my doctor, just my my gynecologist woman doctor, and she said, "Do you think you need something?" And I looked at her and I go, "Well, I think," this is before any warnings, "I think the drug is what killed him." But I said, more importantly, I looked at her and I go, "Aren't I supposed to hurt? My husband died. Aren't I supposed to hurt?" And she literally said to me, "But you don't need to." And I will never forget that. And so obviously the pain and all of that and the trauma is real. Heartache is real. I wanted to scratch out my broken heart. And if I had long fingernails back then, I would have clawed it out. But I had scratch marks on my heart because I wanted to take it out. So pain is real. But this idea of you don't need to, and this what we're doing, no, how about the fact is my husband died and they were going to just, that is not a mental health, that is not a mental illness, number one. And just when I look back at my husband, why he got even put on the drug, because he was a guy that, again, listened to the doctor. He loved that he was an athlete, so they always fixed him. But if I think about why he got put on it because he wasn't sleeping. Are you kidding me? That is not being waking up in the middle of the night as an entrepreneur because you just started a business is not a mental illness either. But throwing a Zoloft on top of it, that's what they gave him. And so I've been doing this work for 22 years. Come full circle, I actually ended up on the FDA advisory committee, the same one that in 91 didn't do their job. So I get to be this voice that can be the voice that nobody was there for Woody back then. And for the countless of other like Ashley's that we're going to hear from, these kids. I met so many families who lost their kids that 12, 13 years old, and they got it for test anxiety because got nervous for taking a test. And that was the marketing. And I'll just say one last thing is how this was also, I was able to see it all, is I've spent my entire career in advertising and marketing. So our whole business is about creating narratives. Our business is about selling. And if there's one thing I've learned about the pill model, it's a business. And it has to go through the FDA because it's a regulation. It's how you get the product on the market. We're one of only 2 countries in the world that allow drug ads. So right there, it's marketing. And all we heard was, "You have a chemical imbalance," and little bouncing balls. "Are you nervous in front of people? You may have social anxiety disorder." And so anyways, the whole thing I have come to realize, we are not helping people. So I love what you're doing as see the person and not like a diagnosis, because I think going full circle back to my free arts kids, these kids were not broken. And I remember at one of their big fundraisers, I said, do not label these kids, because once you label kids or anybody and you're told that you're broken, you will live into it because you think you are broken. And then when you throw in meds that make you already a little, they start adding things to you that is not normal because it's chemicals, then you're thinking you are broken. And so I love what you do, and I look forward to the discussion and hearing Ashley's story.
So right before Ashley's story, I just want to tell you about how we even came up with a name. So I'm teaching at a university with master's and doctoral students, and that are one day going to be practitioners. And this woman comes in, the story is actually on our website. The woman comes in and says, "I hate my client." And I was like, oh my goodness, that was I just had never heard anybody say that. And I was just kind of thinking in my mind, it must be very difficult because something's happening that's making a licensed professional not like their client. The word, of course, was taken out of context. And So I asked this person, what do you hate about your client? And they said, I don't know. And whenever someone tells me they don't know, they haven't pulled together those thoughts, right? I'm not going to force somebody. I don't care if it's in teaching or if it's in therapy or other types of endeavors where we're talking with other human beings. And so it was a small class, and we had a conversation about what happens when you don't like your client. And usually it is that they're not doing what you want them to do because you come from an expert position, right? Theories teach you that you're expert into people's life, just like medications do, right? And so we had a conversation about what do you do when that happens? Or maybe that person reminds you of your uncle who you don't like, or maybe they have political convictions that are different from you, or the list can go endless. And so we had a conversation about that. And so the next week she came back and she said, the client that I hated is now my most beloved client. And I was like, oh, wow, we need to get that on tape. So we went into another room and signed some consents, and everybody went in and was talking about this. And she said for the first time in 10 sessions that she left the progress notes outside the door. She left what the psychiatrist said outside the door. She left what the previous therapist had written or her peers had said or the supervisor. And for the first time in 10 sessions, she walked in with an open heart. And so
Mhm.
for the first time, she saw a person in front of her and that she could understand what was happening and how it was her treatment plan. It wasn't that person's treatment plan. And that she didn't have an understanding of even the struggles that she was going through. And when she started getting more of understanding, she could see how perfectly normal it was that was going on with her. And what we have done is that and they do not get in the system. Then they can continue to be normal people. But when we have people that go see a psychiatrist, a gynecologist, a GP, a PCP, a psychiatrist, psychologist, marriage and family therapist, licensed counselor, social worker, and they start to speak, they've lost their voice. They've lost their self identity, and it's going to be changed. And the outcome can be extremely devastating. So I just wanted to sneak that in a little bit. Maybe you would have some thoughts on this, which I think that you probably do.
Hi. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for sharing your story and sharing your perspective. I'm sorry for the loss of your husband. That's horrible and heart-wrenching. And I am impressed by your strength to come forward and be able to not let this happen to other people. Because unfortunately, this is something that is taking over modern day, and it's horrible to witness. And especially with my generation, I'm 25. So a lot of the time, there's a really interesting community around, excuse me, sorry. There's a really interesting community around mental health and about mental illness diagnoses. And there's almost this cult that forms around having a diagnosis and being labeled with one. And because it's so easy to get these medications and so easy to get a mental illness diagnosis, you kind of stick to it and you cling to it really deeply. I remember when I was like, gosh, I was 11 years old and they hit me with the big D diagnosis. They were like, you have major depression. And it wasn't because I was a teenager getting bullied at school and going through challenging things at home. To them, it was a chemical imbalance in my brain, and there was something super wrong with me. And it wasn't that if I switched my environment, then I would be okay. And they were like, oh, here's a bunch of medications. And it does mess with you. It chemically messes with you because the conversation is that people are not having is these are hard drugs. These are heavy and hard drugs that give you sometimes really high highs and really low lows. And all of them are a little bit different, but they have the same effect. And I've seen it with my peers. I see them go up and down. And I've gone through those cycles as well. And I've also seen it with, I've had friends and roommates that have had used street drugs, and I don't see a difference between methamphetamines and Adderall and antidepressants because you still go through those cycles of being really alert and awake for 3 days and being really depressed for another 3 days. and it's horrible, and it's ruining a generation. It's creating a generation of zombies, and I'm very upset and very passionate about this, which is why I do the volunteer work that I do with Now I See a Person, to help people get off these antidepressants, because they are going through really big drug withdrawals, but people are not seeing it as drugs because it's for their mental health. It's seen as good for you, should be, right? And running is amazing for your health, but I'm sorry, but taking small dosages of these substances that are ruining your mind and your mental balance and stability is not good for anyone. And perhaps that's a bold statement, but this is coming from someone who not only was on antidepressants at a really young age and had to go through that withdrawal process, and also had to go through all these doctors that were telling me. I know the first time that I was trying to get off antidepressants, they told me that legally I had to take them. They force you to take them, and it's horrible because it's killing people. It's ruining their minds. And I'm sorry that you had to lose your husband. And I'm sorry that you had to lose someone you care for so deeply. And I don't want to see anyone else get hurt from this. So thank you for advocating. And I hope that people can listen more.
Well, I was going to say, Ashley, I'm listening to you. You could be my niece, and I never had kids. But when I started learning all of this and the documents I saw that I got out from lawsuit against Pfizer, and you knew that the FDA knew about it, and that I'm seeing all these families who have been destroyed, little 10, 12-year-old, 13-year-olds. I was like, I'm fighting for them, and I'm fighting for the new. And so I actually also really want to say your generation got caught is the one. And I love how you described it as a cult. And I love that you're doing volunteer work, because we need your generation to wake up to and push back at these. And I also love that you're an artist, because I also feel like this idea of, as humans, and going way back to just being a human, we all come into this world to be self-expressive and to create. But if you've been numbed out by drugs, sometimes some of our greatest works come from the most painful places. And if you don't have that pain to use it, and of course having the right support people, Dr. Susan and stuff around you, therapists, but I think about what I was able to do with my advocacy. That came from the most painful place I've ever been. And I didn't drug it, and I didn't run away from the pain. I actually ran towards it, number one. And also, when you start learning all of these things, you're like, if those guys, it's not about money. We're trading people's lives for money. So I really think I want to encourage, because I think it's this younger generation. I've met kids that are like, oh, I'm on Zoloft. I'm like, for what? I'm thinking, I know their family. I'm like, why are you on Zoloft? And they're like, oh, and sometimes I forget to take it. It's like this, it's almost like a badge of honor, or I'm a Lexa-ho and a Lexa-bro. I hear all of these things with the younger kids right now. They're probably a little younger than you. This is what we've created. And instead of teaching resilience and creativity and seeing people like, this is what life is. Life is ups and downs, but that's the beauty of life. Having someone who's already gone through it, Woody was 25 years or 22 years ago, but I've come on the other side, and I look at all of the gifts that I can honestly say, if it wasn't for the pain that I went through, I would not have had the gifts that I've discovered today because of it. So anyways, I just want to say, I love when I see people like you getting involved.
Thank you. I also agree that by channeling your emotions into creativity, and that you can create such phenomenal works. If we're going to talk about history for a second, because I'm an artist, I love art history. I love making art. I love everything about the creative passion process. It requires passion. Humans are passionate beings. This is what makes us human. This is what gives us the soul of life. If you look at Francis Bacon, He has a collection of works that they're a bit intense, right? They're really difficult to look at sometimes, but you see the soul, you see the passion. Or even if we go back even further to something that more people will understand, if you look at the Greeks, you can really see how art brought the life into people. Like, took someone chipping away at marble every day to depict the crucifixion of Christ, to depict that we can surpass human suffering. Or I'm sorry, Christ is more the Romans, but with Greeks, that's when they were depicting the gods like Hermes and Aphrodite. But also, the Greeks have this one thing about them that I really love, is that they had such a sacred ritual around grieving. When someone died, they would have funerary parties where they would parade the streets, tearing out their hair and tearing off their clothes, and they would spend so much money and time on their graves and their honoring of what a life was, because we should be marked by the things in our life. Because if we're not marked and moved by the things that are in our life, what's the point?
So well said.
And the problem that happens is that when we enter into this relationship with psychiatry or even psychology, is that in marriage and family therapy, we learn a different definition than the celebration of life, right? Or being able to process grief. We're told that what we're doing has pathology, that is abnormal. So the things that for centuries, right, have kept us as human beings has been taken away from us. And we're a society of disability, not celebration. And that narrative of disability permeates everything. So we don't see ourselves as being able to be overcomers, for lack of a better word. We're bound, and we receive this by marketing. Well, we are, but I'm saying kind of that the marketing has affected the providers. And so when the providers, like your gynecologist, was going to hand you possibly the same medication that killed your husband, they thought that it was good practice. This
Yeah.
is they are taught.
Well, and it's interesting. So when you say marketing, I remember one of the first things that the PHQ-9 form, which is pretty standard, they say it's industry standard. I know it's adopted by a lot of insurance companies, but also a lot of the therapists. Everybody uses this form, the PHQ-9, which is, you know, every time I go to the doctor, it now says, in which I try to stay away from the doctors personally, but every time it says in my paperwork, I will not fill out the PHQ-9 form, which it was created by Pfizer Inc. and by 3 key opinion leaders. And so once you understand the business behind it, even though it might be sold, and I think that people are doing therapists and things that really believe, or psychologists that they do believe and they're helping, but they've just bought into this idea of that, the funnel, but not really understanding the business model behind it. And that is, as we call it in marketing, that's kind of a lead generator. That's how you get people. I remember I worked on a client, Land's End, which is a big clothing company, and we were their first ad agency because most of what they did was using the catalog. But they said, all we need you to do is get us all these people up here that would never consider Land's End, because once they get into the catalog, they're ours. And so I was like, oh, wait, the PHQ-9, that's the same thing. Get all these people up here to fill out something that says, in the last 2 weeks, have you felt sad? Have you felt less than worthy? All of these things that are just human things, but there's nothing in there that actually gives you a place of context of, well, maybe that person just lost their dog. Maybe their daughter moved to Europe and so they were sad, but so of course they're sad or whatever. And so there's no context around it, and it's just a quick marketing. I think that whole idea, I would say I just finished this book, and I'm going to be writing, I was asked to write a review for a medical journal, but it's called Chemically Imbalanced, and it's the making and unmaking of the serotonin myth. And this book I would highly recommend because it goes through a lot of work, and it's written by a psychiatrist, Joanna Moncrief, out of the UK. But it is fantastic because you really see how we've been told and sold a bill of goods that we have chemical imbalances. So anyways, I'm just putting a plug in for the book because I just finished it and it's
Awesome. I read I don't know what you call it, but it was 12 minutes what you wrote or what you talked about. It was so profound. You do not know how many people I sent that to. And so one of the reasons why I started out by saying this was life-saving, I don't know if I said it before we started talking or after we started talking, but it is. When we have clients that have been through what my colleague calls commercial psychiatry, and they've been convinced that they're a mental illness diagnosis, and when they hear your voice or when they hear Ashley's voice, makes a huge difference, not a small difference. Because I can say things like this, and my voice then says, what am I marketing? Right? I don't have a clean voice as much as I would love to, because I'm in a business that has a unit of money that's attached to people, right? And so I remember we wrote some articles on Mad in America, and people were angry, not at us, but at what other places had did to them. Because at one point in time, we used to work a lot with horses. And so art would have people come out, but we never ever put anybody on medication. And when I talk about no one, I talk about before decades, not one person was. When you don't think about that commercialization, there's so many more possibilities. There's an aunt or uncle, there's a brother or a sister, there's a mother or father. There's somebody that can take in people where they aren't being put into walls of isolation and walls of abnormalcy. Do you ever think to yourself, when someone goes into a mental hospital, why they lose their cell phones, why they can't talk to their family for the first 3 days that they're there? Because they're acclimating to the unit. So what would that title be in marketing?
well, that's key. I mean, it is the acclimation, the reprogramming. It's the detaching from what old beliefs are, and we're going to put new ones in you. It's giving you time to pre-sell something.
And depend on that marketer. So for example,
Right. I was going to say, for sure, if you're in the hospital, you're like, well, of course, I'm here because I'm going to get better. And we've all been told that that's why you have, why you go to the hospital, and it's a that in itself, I've heard people that go there and they end up in the locked hall because they were having an anxiety attack. And then it's like for 72 hours, it's a automatic hold. And I was like, wait, you mean your family can't come in? Nope. You don't have a phone? Nope. I'm like, what? And so to me, I was like, how do you, like, that's pretty scary in a situation. As a person, I have never been there, but I can only imagine you already are having anxiety and you're just pouring more anxiety into them because you're locking them up with nothing that they're familiar with.
Mhm.
Actually, would you say that that's part of the beginnings of the cult in some ways? Or I know you were going to respond to that. I don't want to take whatever.
The most definitely that it adds to this cult mentality and concepts. And again, perhaps it's a bit bold to say, but by cult, there's this level of brainwashing that happens, right? You're going to a doctor who has studied this for many years. They have a position of authority over you, and you're amongst other people that are apparently under similar circumstances to you. And I have been, actually, that's funny that you speak of having an anxiety attack and then getting put on a hold, because that has happened to me where I got hit by a car and I went to the ER and I was just really anxious and scared, and then they gave me a shot without asking me, and then I got really anxious and I started crying, and then they put me on a hold. And I was 19 at the time, and they did that because I had the label of anxiety on my chart. So they instantly just were like, we have to do something about this. And it was really scary, and they didn't take into the consideration that I just got hit by a car, and I'm like really freaked out. But it's horrible because they're pulling what's human out of us and replacing it with this idea that we should always be numb, because we shouldn't. That's not what being human is about. We're emotional beings. We're expressive beings. We're not machines. We're really not. You can't expect things to just go to work and be content with sitting in a cubicle all day and looking at gray walls. We're meant to be exploring and having friends and intellectual conversations. We're meant to be doing so much more with our lives. So it sucks that to treat this emotional state, it's bad for us instead of giving us avenues to channel this energy. And I love art and expression because it's a healthy and safe way for people to explore their emotional depths and what makes life worth living. Because even if something wretched happens to you, you can make something beautiful and monumental out of it. You can transform and transmute that energy into something that will hopefully make the world a little bit brighter or better, or maybe even just give someone else peace of mind. Because I've gone into museums and just been in awe. That's why I like to talk about Francis Bacon, because even though his stuff can be morbid, in some of my darker moments, it gave me peace of mind. It made me not feel alone. And I feel like that's what we're doing a little bit here with the podcast, is we're making people not feel alone and raising awareness and consciousness around, hey, it's okay that you feel something. We're meant to feel everything.
Amen. We're meant to feel it
Now,
all. Like, that is life. And you said not to, what I will never forget somebody I met along the way. He's a filmmaker, and he ended up making a documentary out of his experience. But he was a filmmaker and commercial filmmaker, but also movie. But he did a documentary on himself because he woke up one day and his baby was born and his mother died within a week apart from each other. And so those are two extremely emotionally different experiences, right? And he said he felt nothing. He was flat. And then he started bringing him down the question of, wait a minute, is it maybe what is it? Is it my drug? So he started going down and looking at Paxil. And then he realized, oh, wait, I've been on Paxil for 10 years. Why was I put on Paxil? And he got put on Paxil when, after a breakup, after some woman from college who he's not married today. And so but he'd been taking this drug for multiple years. And it was only when he had a life differing expression and emotions and all that, death and birth, right? The extremes. And he felt nothing. And so I love that when he took his curiosity of wondering if it was the drug, but he made a film out of it. Comfortably Numb was the name of the film. And so I look at all of this and I think it's a conversation. It's not saying it's right or wrong. People can do whatever they want, but I think that at the end of the day, what they need to have the information. They need to be told the honest, transparent truth about and including, let's try something. If you're going to go on this drug, you might want to try these alternatives first. You mentioned, Ashley, running or a drug, or it could be art and a drug, or you're going to feel, or you're going to go to therapy, or surround yourself with friends, go volunteer. All of these things that may or may not do anything, but at least you have options. And then if you are going to decide, ultimately, once you have the full truth about most of the antidepressant trials, for instance, were only 6 to 8 weeks long. And so what a lot of people don't understand that, and they don't necessarily even understand the history of antidepressants. Maybe they don't even understand the warnings. Maybe they don't even understand where we've been. But once you have all that information and you decide it's what you want to do, at least have an exit strategy. These are not meant to be on for 20, 25, 30 years, because a lot of times, but if you've been told you're broken, you think it is your blood pressure pill, but that's not the truth.
No, you are told it's like a heart medication, or that it's something to chemically balance you. It's supposed to help your moods. But in reality, being on these drugs for long periods of time is horrible for the mind. I was told that this was something that I would have to do for the rest of my life, and that it was something, and I haven't been on antidepressants for years now, and I feel all my feelings, but I am okay. On a daily basis, I am okay. I'm pretty happy. I'm content. I'm living my life. And if something is not right, then I have a way to express it and channel it properly. And I don't feel like I need something to chemically make me numb, because being numb is worse than feeling things. And there's life without emotion isn't a life to live.
Well, and at least you're in control of that. What a lot of our colleagues talk about, there's no informed consent. They don't get this. If you think about this, what it was the 80s that we started putting kids on, all of a sudden, 1 week there's no ADHD, and the next week there's ADHD, and 1 week there's speed, and we have slogans like speed kills. And then the next week you have children being put on speed. And I've spoken to so many parents of adults that are in their 30s and 40s, and their parents were told that these were safe drugs. Even if they were a nurse or something like that, and they were asking about this, no, we're not going to give you anything that's not safe. I cannot tell you how many times that I've heard that. And so people aren't really getting informed consent. And then trickling down to the psychologist and the marriage and family therapist or the licensed practical counselors, they don't know. Maybe someone listening to this, they'll know this for the first time. This is not known knowledge. And I talk to people about how can that change and why did that happen? And so you have a lot of people that have written wonderful books and they did wonderful documentaries, but there's still so much of not the informed consent that we have out there today. And so how do we make that available? If people want to do drugs, whether they're legal drugs or illegal drugs, that's their choice in life. But they need the consequences. So what about giving the legal drugs the same fair shake? So I don't know if you guys would like to wrap this up, because for me, this is, even if no one watches this, our clients will watch them. The people that we work with, we can control that narrative, right? We can say, we know of somebody and things were different. You've got to realize what some of the outcomes are. I just did a podcast with Rick Fee. I don't know if you know who he is, but he's a wonderful man, and I can send that to you. And he lost his son to Adderall. And all the people that have watched this so far, that they're on Adderall or their children are, or some other type of stimulant, it's a life-changing type of situation when you hear that there are unknown consequences that you don't get to hear about, which is almost unbelievable. And so, Kim, what are you trying to do now then to promote this, that this isn't going to be one of those lost narratives?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I've been telling my story for a long time. I've been telling Woody's story, and I'm now starting to switch and really talk a little bit more about my healing journey, which I was the one that suffered the trauma. Woody's dead, right? And so I'm right in the process of writing the book, and also writing the book through, because that grief changed me, who I was. I was the person who never taught. I was the good girl in the corner. I cried, but to my cat, as I said, never showed my emotion. I held everything in. I didn't want it. And so I learned that, wow, walking through the fire that I went through is actually what made me who I am today. And I'm so grateful for it. So I'm trying to tell that story too, so that people know that, and then educate along the way of all the things that I learned about Woody and whatnot. So I'm working on that. And then I also want to say that I actually would love to take this. This is raw content. This video, this conversation with Ashley, I do podcasts all the time, and to have somebody with her lived experience in a younger generation to be out there talking and doing amazing things. I want Ashley's story, and maybe it already is out there, but I would love to see it go. I would love to personally even get this video and cut it up, chop it up, and put little clips with it, because I think there's nothing better than somebody, and especially in that Instagram world, than hearing from Ashley, who's been through it, what she's done, and hearing what your organization do too. So I feel like we should definitely make sure that this goes wider. And if it helps your clients, amazing, because that's one person is one person, and one person leads to another person, and it's the butterfly effect. But I would love to not, there's a lot of rich coming. I listened to Ashley and I'm like, whoa, this is so rich. This needs to be out there.
I know. And I agree with you. I say that her voice is priceless, and it is. And so I think that we all had priceless voices today. I'd like for us to be able to stay on just for a few minutes, but I'm just going to stop the recording at this point in time. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for listening.